Ambassador Peter will share his thoughts on the current international affairs and the role of the West. And the first 20 minutes, 25 minutes, it's going to be, we're going to listen to Ambassador Peter. And then we're going to open the floor for Q&A. And thank you, Ambassador, for your time. The floor is yours.
Thank you, Yared. I'll stand up because when you're standing up, you're more alert. It's a fact. Did you know that? Believe me. Your brain is more engaged, your blood is flowing better, and it guarantees you'll stay awake. I want to begin with a little news item in the British press today that doesn't seem to have anything to do with Ukraine, but really it says everything. It's from The Guardian, the financial pages, and it says that the head of a betting firm in England, casinos, slot machines, stuff like that, was paid last year £300 million. Salary of £300 million. Why is this relevant? This is a British oligarch. That's what it means. That's what the word really means. Oligarch, somebody who has an enormous salary. But in the British media, nobody makes this connection. We have oligarchs, the bankers, the casino owners and their operatives. We have oligarchs, but no one thinks to accuse them. Poor Roman Abramovich, the Chelsea guy, is demonized. Admittedly, I'm not a Chelsea fan, I'm West Ham myself, but still, the guy, you can't blame the guy for making Chelsea world champions. I don't know what Abramovich has done in terms of supporting Putin, but I rather think he's not broken any British laws, and yet he's being hounded like he was a murderer or a criminal, all because he's described as an oligarch. Notice the importance of these emotional terms, oligarchs. And the second little item of news was, that's the BBC, they're on to me, are they? Already? Hey, I've only just started. Next little piece of news is about the BBC in a way. Again, it had nothing on the surface to do with Ukraine, but it was about a guy, a sad case, obviously a mentally disturbed person with a criminal record who was in court accused of spreading misinformation about COVID. And in particular, what he did was to blame the COVID epidemic on Jews. I mean, this is a horrible thing to do, but the guy clearly was not right in the head. He had a history of being disturbed. What happened to him in court? He was sent to prison for 12 years. 12 years for spreading misinformation. Now, why is this relevant to Ukraine? Because just before coming out, I was hearing the TV news, and they were going on about Putin has made it a crime in Russia to spread misinformation about what's going on in Ukraine. So here's the guy we're sending down for 12 years with mental problems just for spreading vicious misinformation about COVID. Who are we to talk about Putin? I mean, which is also wrong. Nobody should control free speech. But there you also have the BBC rejoicing because their competitors, RT, are not able to broadcast. You see the double standards in play here constantly. Now, this may surprise you coming from a former British diplomat, but I've had enough exposure to the world, particularly developing countries in North Africa and Western Asia, the Arab world, and of course through my acquaintance with Eritrea and through having a very proud Eritrean wife, Al-Ganesh, who's currently in Asmara, but she's given me her blessing to say what I'm saying. The double standards are blatant. We'll come back to that, but I want to zero in now on that General Assembly vote a couple of days ago in New York, in which Eritrea distinguished itself by voting against a motion condemning Russia. One of only 5 countries in the world that voted against the motion. And there you had the Western media exulting at this overwhelming vote. 141 countries voted against the Russians, voted to condemn Russia, voted with Europe and the West, the Americans, the West. And this was presented by all the British media as an overwhelming victory. Well, they didn't mention that half of Africa did not vote for this resolution. They either voted against, like Eritrea, or they abstained, or they did not participate in the vote. But half of the continent of Africa is not 100% with the West on this. Africa has good reasons to understand that the situation in Ukraine or over Ukraine is complicated. And you can also make things worse as well as better by increasing hostility. And this fact, the fact that half of the continent of Africa wasn't with us, the West, was totally ignored by the BBC and the other media. This is not just double standards, this is racism. Let's call it what it is. When they say that the world is with us, what they mean is the white world. Yeah, I can say that. I can say that, and it's true. The hypocrisy, and many of these people are liberals who are there with the Black Lives Matter people bending the knee, but when the moment of truth comes, we're whites, aren't we? We see this also in the way we're receiving refugees. Some of the statements made in the media about this are shockingly, openly racist. We have to welcome them because they're white and they're Christian. Can these people not hear themselves speak? The double standards, the racism. But an important point perhaps for your public diplomacy is don't let anybody say that Eritrea was alone. Half of Africa did not go along with this motion condemning Russia. You see, it all depends how you frame the issue. You know, the facts can be presented usually in one of 2 ways. The BBC chose to present it as, 141 out of 193 voted against Russia, overwhelming victory. Or they could have said, well, somehow 50 countries, a quarter of the membership, weren't persuaded to go along with us. That's not so great. That's framing the issue. Generally, it involves an omission. You omit to mention that half of Africa and a lot of countries in Asia didn't go along with it. Framing by omission. This is the biggest sin of the BBC, by the way. It's not so much what they say, it's what they don't say. Half the truth that they omit, so that you get a distorted picture. Eritrea has been on the receiving end of this for many, many years. I don't need to tell many of you, I'm sure. And we see it coming out, the same thing with Syria, with and now with Ukraine. I'm jumping about a bit here because there have been two mega developments, haven't there, in the last 2 years. One has been this Ukraine conflict, and the other has been the COVID crisis. Now, on the surface, they don't have much in common, but actually they do. And it's quite interesting. It helps us to understand both, to see what's going on, what the similarities are. And the first aspect that caught my attention was that lockdowns are like sanctions. They are a response by governments that have no idea what to do, but have to do something because the media are demanding that governments do something, control COVID or control the Russian virus, because of course Russia is the virus here. You have the COVID crisis and you have the Russian virus crisis. And lockdown was the response of mainly Western governments that had no idea how to react, but felt obliged because they were weak. They didn't all have lockdowns. There were one or two brave governments like Sweden that refused to go along with most of it. And their final result was at least as good as anybody else, because lockdowns were futile. But this lockdown model was virtually imposed on the rest of the world through the WHO, World Health Organization, which is, I can tell you this because I worked inside the UN organization for 8 years after I left the British Foreign Office. WHO, like other UN agencies, is controlled by the West, with some influence, in the case of WHO, from China, because they get a lot of money from China, number one. Number two, the Bill Gates Foundation. These are the two main contributors of funds to the WHO. And China, as you'll remember, was the first to apply the lockdown mode. And at first, didn't we laugh? Oh, China locking down a whole city. How can they possibly do that? This can only happen in a communist, totalitarian society. It could never happen here. Within a week, we were doing the same thing because we were panicking. But then it became the Western model, which, through the advice of the WHO, was imposed on countries worldwide. And not all countries are the same. Poorer countries in Africa and Asia should never have tried to apply lockdown. I mean, it's easy for us British. The government will pay us to sit on our backside at home for a year doing nothing. In most countries in Africa and Asia, you don't need me to tell you, that is not how it works. And so these lockdowns, this following the Western model, caused immense suffering and deaths and economic damage, tore societies apart in African and Asian countries. So that's, and sanctions, here's the comparison. Sanctions do the same thing. They are a measure which Western governments love because it looks like they're being tough and macho. They don't actually work. Can anyone name me an example of sanctions that have actually worked? With Iran, that didn't work. With Syria, that didn't work. Didn't work with Iraq. In the end, we had to go to war, or we chose to go to war with them because sanctions didn't work. Eritrea, well, you know better than me. Sanctions are the weapon the West uses when it hesitates to send in the military. But they are a form of undeclared war. But they don't work. And similarly, sanctions on Russia today. Can anybody seriously, can they explain to me how they think sanctions are going to work? You know, you watch the TV news every night, and I'm listening. Will somebody even attempt to explain how sanctions are going to work? Does anybody want to argue that Putin will wake up tomorrow and say, hey, this is getting all a bit hot, I think I'll change my mind, guys, come back? No, that is unthinkable. So how are sanctions going to work? They're not going to work. If things go badly, the world will be stuck with these sanctions. And here's the other thing. They harm us more than they harm Russia in the long term. We're already beginning to pay a price through the petrol pump, through gas prices. It will get much, much worse. Our economies will begin to go into recession because of the reverberations of all this. And there will be many, which will take months to amplify and develop. Sterling is dropping like a stone. I've lost 5% off my pension fund because the stock market has come down. And here's the BBC crowing because the ruble is down. I don't care. I care about my pension fund. Sanctions like lockdown, they don't work, and they come back and bite you. They're more harmful than they do any good. So there are these odd parallels between the COVID crisis and the Ukraine crisis. But still staying with the COVID crisis, now I'm going to be a bit controversial here. I haven't been controversial so far. Vaccines. Now, whatever you think about vaccines, and I'm not a fan, but even if I was a fan, I would have to accept that for a continent like Africa, they're not really as necessary as they seem to be in countries with older populations like Britain. The average age in Africa is about 10 years below that of Britain. So the COVID was never going to harm African populations the same as it did the British or the Europeans. There was a much lower need for vaccines. That's the first point. And yet they were imposed by Bill Gates and WHO and the rest of the world. They were imposed on Africa. These were the model that had to be followed if you wanted to appear modern, if you wanted the favors of the West. It was a kind of health imperialism. I just made that up. Health imperialism. And then you saw the way we treated South Africa when the Omicron variant appeared on the scene. South Africa behaved impeccably. They reported very early on to the WHO that we've got this new variant, but it's nothing really to worry about. And WHO immediately went to panic stations, passed on this information to even more panicky countries like Britain, which immediately laid siege to South Africa. Oh, Omicron closed down the borders, South Africa, pariah, This was totally unfair to a developing country which had done the honest thing and been rewarded with a boycott, which for a couple of months did serious damage to South Africa's economy. And all the while, the figures themselves showed that the Omicron was nothing to worry about in South Africa. But we panicked, and we punished the people who'd done the right thing. And this was also racist. I don't think we'd have done this with a white country, but with South Africa, and nobody said a word. Has there been an apology? Has anybody said, sorry, South Africa, you were right, the Omicron really shouldn't have sent us to panic stations? Has anybody talked about compensation?
Of course not.
Because they should do.
Yeah.
No, pass on, it's Africa, forget it. I'm jumping about a bit, but China, we can't discuss world affairs without talking about China. And did you notice how the coverage of China in the West is that, Putin thought he had China's support, but China abstained on the resolutions in the UN, and China's turning against Putin. Well, there is absolutely no evidence for this belief. This is an example of wishful thinking. And if there is one term to characterize Western policy making, it's wishful thinking. You assume that what you want is what's going to happen. So we want China to move against Russia, and therefore we predict that China will do this on zero evidence. The facts, as we know them so far, suggest that before Putin launched his operation, a short while before, he went to Beijing and almost certainly told the Chinese what was going to happen and secured an assurance of Chinese support in key areas. Financial, I imagine, was crucial. And nothing has happened since to make me think that this has changed. Because imagine the West win in Ukraine. What does that mean for China? It would be a disaster for China. It would be the total end of their hopes of resisting Western hegemony. The end of, they could kiss goodbye to any hopes they ever had of recovering Taiwan. So the idea that the Chinese could connive at the end of Putin is absolutely ridiculous. But Western analysts indulge this wishful thinking always. I just read this evening in the Evening Standard a piece by a former head of the British Armed Forces, Lord Dannatt. And every line is just wishful thinking. He ends up concluding that Ukraine will resist successfully Russia. I mean, this is just stupid. He's not paying attention. This is not going to be what happens. Maybe later we can go into forecasts of what will happen over Ukraine. But the point I'm making here is about how the West deludes itself, how it practices double standards, and how it's self-defeating. It's especially sanctions, because this is particularly relevant to Eritrea. And it was one of the reasons quoted by your ambassador in New York in explaining the Eritrean vote. You have every reason to express reservations about how sanctions are applied without discrimination. Even if America and Britain think that sanctions are only directed at individuals, in the end they're not. It's the whole population that suffers. But we Westerners can't think straight about any of these issues. We demonize. So everything is boiled down to Putin. Why? I think it's partly because that makes it easier for us. easier to understand, but while not understanding, in fact, it avoids having to understand the complexity of the situation. It's sort of demonizing Putin, saying he's a madman. When you say somebody's a madman, that's the end of the discussion, isn't it? You don't need to ask why he's mad. Oh, he's a madman. He's got a knife, just to get rid of him. You don't have to look into the background, whether he might have a reason to be angry, whether Russia might have reasons to be paranoid against the West, which insists on driving up the frontiers of NATO to Russia's own borders. No, by demonizing their leader, it's the end of the discussion. So we jumped around a bit, but I'll just finish by saying a word about our own dear leader, Boris Johnson. Hasn't this crisis been a wonderful godsend to him? We've forgotten all about Partygate. Wow. He has milked this crisis like nobody else on earth. This is why Britain has played such a forward role in the whole thing, because it's a distraction away from... On the eve of this, Johnson was on the ropes. His job was in peril. If I was a conspiracy theorist, I think he might have colluded with Putin, you know. Some people think that he is in the pocket of the Russians. I think that's perhaps an exaggeration, but he has an interest in ramping up this crisis so that we forget Partygate. So on that happy note, I'll conclude, but I look forward to having this open discussion with you all. Thank you.